Alright everyone, hello, and today, we talk a lot about things that you should do in the kitchen when it comes to just basic cooking skill, but we don't talk a lot about things you should not do, which I've done plenty of. So, without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about the 5 cooking mistakes that I used to constantly make at the start of learning how to cook, that if you can, I would hope you would avoid. So I did not always used to be a very good cook. Like, I would just burn things. I had to actually buy one of my roommates a replacement pot once because I was making a cream sauce and I left it simmering and just walked away from it and burned the whole bottom of the pot so bad that it was just completely unsalvageable. I would do things like that all the time, and I would also do it because I didn't know at all how to cook, but really wanted to be good at things at the first try. So that brings us into the very first mistake I used to make when I was learning how to cook, which is doing meals that were way above my skill level because they looked really good online. Usually, or at least maybe in my mind, people when they move out of their house can take like some kind of family recipes with them or something, but when I moved out I didn't really have any family recipes yet. I didn't bother asking my mom for any, so I just kind of vaguely remembered the stuff that she made and then also tried to make all these new and exciting and experimental things that never went well. I think one of the most painstaking ones that I made was like a spinach burek, which burek is like basically a Balkan version of spinach pie, and it was very complex, lots of layers of phyllo dough, didn't have enough filling, so on and so forth. It was not fun. As someone who didn't know how to cook and didn't like cooking because she didn't know how to cook, it just made me use a lot of dishes that I didn't need to use and took a lot of time that I could have saved just doing like a one-pot batch of spaghetti or something. And the second issue that I had, and this is one that like honestly only stopped haunting me recently, but if you find a recipe online, you're going on Pinterest, you're going on Yumly, you're going on any of those other sites where there are just like tons of recipes available, do not adjust the recipe until you've made it one time the way that it says to. Because if you start adjusting the recipe thinking that you know better, you're not going to have any frame of reference of what it's supposed to be like in the first place, and so if you try to adjust it to your taste, you're going to be basically fooling around in the dark there. There's going to be absolutely nothing going on that is what it's supposed to be.
It's almost like this is something I recommended to you.
Yes, so my boyfriend would also be like, hey, maybe you should try making the recipe the way that it says to first. And I was like, no, I'll just replace this vegetable with that vegetable, and I'll replace this seasoning with that seasoning, and I'll cut the amount of sugar in half, and I'll blah, blah, blah. You know, doing all of these changes but not understanding why they were in the recipe as written to begin with. One example being when I was trying to candy, like, pieces of lemon, and I was like, 1-to-1 ratio sugar water, that's too much sugar, and then I cut the sugar and ended up not making the syrup that needed to be made to candy the lemons. So there are reasons that the recipes are written the way that they are. To understand what the person who wrote it is trying to do, you need to do the recipe the way that it says to first. Otherwise, everything's screwed up and there's no way for you to figure out where things went wrong. Now honestly, the next 2 things are kind of wrapped up together, but one of the mistakes I used to make when I was starting to cook was that I would be really frustrated that things would take a long time, so I would try to just start cooking right away without prepping any of the other items that I would need. No. Definitely, before you start cooking, especially if you're not used to cooking yet, take the time to set things up, right? Chop things and put them in the bowl. Don't, prioritize saving dishes over having things prepped, because what happens a lot for me, especially in the beginning, was that I would, I'd cut the onion, I'd get it frying, and then I wouldn't be fast enough at prepping everything else, and so the onion would just burn in the pot. You don't want to do that. That's how you end up having to restart a bunch of dishes. That's how you end up all discombobulated, have to take things off the stove because things are boiling over or all this other kind of stuff. Get your ducks in a row beforehand, and then everything else will fall into place. And in that same vein, honestly, this goes with timing meal steps, which is honestly its own whole topic that I could talk about, but when it comes to cooking a meal, the fact of the matter is that especially if it's a multi-part meal, not everything's going to be done at the same time. You don't want to be cooking something like, I don't know, spinach as long as you're cooking a roast, right? So if you're starting like your vegetable side, You don't want to be starting it at the same time as you're starting the meat, which is going to take objectively the longest. Likewise, imagine if you're starting to make a red sauce for spaghetti and you cook your pasta at the same time as the spaghetti sauce, you're just going to have a bunch of mush. You have to time things in a certain way and anticipate when things are going to be done and when you should start certain things. One of the meals that is the kind of biggest contender for something like this is my Slovenian soups, jota and ricet. These have very specific times to start doing other things, because if you don't have the beans going the whole time, they're still going to be crunchy by the time you put them in the pot with everything else. And if you put the bacon in there to boil with the sauerkraut the whole time, it's just going to be even more chewy than it should be. So, and likewise with the potatoes, if you boil those too much, they just disintegrate into a goopy, weird, wet paste. And we want them to still resemble potatoes. We don't want them to be a paste. Another good example is a meal that I just made that will be coming out on my blog and in the recipe card soon, but when it comes to, making something like steak and all the vegetable sides, the vegetables and potatoes have to bake in the oven for about an hour. Steak does not take an hour to cook, not even remotely. So you have to be able to get everything set up and in the oven, get all of the last bits prepped, right? Like I was spending a good 30 of those 45 minutes waiting before the steak, just dealing with pomegranates. And then you want to be cleaning as you go, all that other kind of stuff. When you're cooking, you want to be mindful of the longest thing. Cook the longest thing first, get everything else ready in the meantime. It's what makes the end of the meal such a mad scramble to get right, but also it makes sure that nothing is burned, which is really important. I'm not gonna lie though, this is why Thanksgiving was such a nightmare for me. The first time I tried to do like a full Thanksgiving was because there was pretty much nothing to do while the turkey cooked, because you can't like start all of the food, 3 hours before people come. But then in the last 30 minutes before people come over, that's when all of a sudden everything needs to happen at once, and it's easy to get overwhelmed, and it's easy to lose track of things, and it's easy to have stuff cook too soon, not soon enough, all of blah blah blah. And now you have things going cold, you have things burning. It's a nightmare. So you want to really know how long it's going to take you to get everything done. Prep it all beforehand so you spend as little time having to chop it and kind of like play catch up as possible. And just streamline the process so you don't absolutely lose your mind. And my last cooking thing I would do is I would not have like a cohesive like flavor palette lined up. Like I would just kind of combine different things that sounded good. Like I would have potatoes with one flavor profile and I'd have meat with a completely different flavor profile. And like when you have them all touching on the same plate, it's just like not good. So don't do that, right? This is why one pot meals are honestly the best for people who are learning how to cook from the first time, because it's one pot. You really can't mess up the flavor profile that bad. BJ! Hi, bitch! Oh, wings! When it's something like spaghetti, there's really only one flavor spaghetti can be. Same with chili, same with, taco bowls, same with all that kind of stuff. There's really only one flavor it's gonna have. And so you don't have to worry about like some other part having a totally different flavor and clashing with it. When you make 3-part meals like, meatloaf and potatoes and all that kind of stuff, then it can potentially get tricky, right? If you have something savory like meatloaf, you don't want to go like super floral or super light with the potatoes. That would be odd. That would be not recommended. So think about what spices are going together on the same plate, right? Like don't just think about, okay, well, this type of spice goes really well with these vegetables. No. You want to think about what the whole plate's going to taste like and make sure that it has some kind of unifying theme or idea, or just like that it complements each other in some way, or else you're going to like really, really like one side of the plate and the other side of the plate's going to be like just not correct in the middle of it all. And a bonus mistake, just because I need to say it, this one doesn't really have to do with cooking, but rather the stuff you're doing after cooking. Clean as you go. Clean the kitchen as you cook. Especially if you're making stuff like one-pot meals, where it's like takes a long time to simmer for a while. Don't just sit there playing on your phone or farting around for that literal hour that something is on the stove simmering. Clean the dishes, wipe the table down, put things away. That way, when the food is done, it doesn't look like a total nightmare came through your kitchen. This is something looking back was really aggravating when I was in college living with roommates, because, all of us would be stressing out, freaking out, being dumb in the kitchen basically. We had like people helping. We had like a whole separate role called sous chef where like another roommate would have to be helping us cook and like chopping things and prepping things and all that stuff. All it really did was put too many people in the kitchen, use a bunch of dishes we didn't need, and then by the end we had a huge sink pile of dishes and no one to actually do anything with it because we were too busy panicking over how we were cooking the food. Don't do that. Set it and forget it, leave it alone. Go clean the kitchen while something is simmering on low. Make sure it's not burning, pause to stir it every now and again, but if it says, bakes for an hour, congratulations, you have an hour to get all that kitchen fixed up so that you don't wake up the next morning with a whole giant disaster to fix up. So those are just some mistakes I used to make and some practical tips if you are just starting to learn how to cook, if you are just kind of figuring your way out with things, and going from like me, no experience at all cooking, to cooking a bunch of other stuff. If you live on your own, by necessity, you're going to have to figure it out to some degree, and so hopefully if you can just avoid the mistakes I made, you can have a lot of really good food every week for little effort, or at least less effort than it would have otherwise been. So, with all that said, I will see you guys next week, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. See ya!